Greetings, this is Eugene the Philosopher, the greatest living philosopher after the unfortunate passing of Quentin Robert de Nameland, who has been the greatest living philosopher before me. In this video, we shall discuss Jordan Peterson. And the reason why I'm doing that is that in the recent couple of months, I've watched a lot of his videos, a lot of his public talks, as well as his university lectures, for example, Maps of Meaning. This cycle of lectures was pretty good. So I had a couple of points to make about Jordan Peterson as a result of that. So I decided to make this video. Now, obviously, a thing that you might notice pretty quickly about Jordan Peterson is that he's pretty smart, well-educated, etc. And he actually says a lot of similar things to what I've been saying, and things that constructivists and people like Bruno Latour again, or Jean Piaget, who's one of the constructivists, whom Peterson quotes himself a lot, are talking. And it kind of caused a little bit of irritation, or you might say annoyance on my part, because, well, I've had this feeling that I'm not so original, you know, this other guy basically says the same things. But okay, anyway, still, there has been a certain disagreement that I felt towards what he said, and in particular, one of the things that did bother me quite a lot was that he never goes to the very end, so to speak, of well, whatever consideration he is engaged in. Like, for example, he is quite concentrated on technical details, like when he says how, let's say, a human being evolves, etc., how human perception and cognition works, etc. He always starts with a presupposition that, well, we are going somewhere, or something to that effect. And then, to go somewhere, we have to construct a map, you know, again, maps of meaning, this whole idea, etc. And, like, build up a context, let's say, well, basically, a map, yeah? Like a system of values, like he says that correctly, that any perception has a value component in it, right? Because if, let's say your perception is of no value, then you don't even have this perception in the first place. Like, even our senses are adjusted in such a way that we only see or perceive in general things that are of value to us somehow, that are relevant towards our progress, towards our goal. But he never says where this motion to the goal comes from and what this goal is. And I believe that all of those questions might be easily answered by this idea of will to power that I keep talking about here. Obviously a Nietzschean idea. So in the end, he ends up with like many correct threads, but they're sort of separate from each other. They're not connected. But whereas I would state that the idea of will to power allows you to connect all those threads and actually make sense of all these processes, or at least I think this is the case. Okay, so this is one disagreement that I have towards him, that he ignores the idea of will to power. But in general, like this video is titled, Who is Jordan Peterson? And I would say that in one word, you can answer this question. There is no question mark, as you might have noticed, and it's because I'm making a statement. I'm not asking a question. So my statement would be that Jordan Peterson is a preacher. This is a very short answer to this question. He's definitely not a scientist, nor he is a philosopher, nor even a philosopher, but he is a preacher, like a typical Protestant preacher, basically, yeah. And his public lectures always look like Protestant masses, or something to that effect. So at best, you might say he's like a moralistic philosopher or something like that, but he's not like a genuinely a philosopher in this sense. You know, this Eric Weinstein, and I'm not sure where it was probably was on Joe Rogan podcast or somewhere else. Eric Weinstein has told him that, to Peterson, I mean, that he has become a one-man answer to the world uncle shortage. Well, his idea was that, you know, this sort of masculine type of wisdom that Peterson or at least supposedly masculine type of wisdom that Peterson shows or like transmits in his lectures and talks. It's like, you know, a good uncle's advice or something like that. But I would say that I would have changed this quote to basically, it's not an uncle shortage, it's really a preacher shortage. And really Peterson plays this role really well. He's like really single-handedly capitalized on this preacher shortage in the world. And by that, I don't really mean anything bad, at least inherently. Like, I mean, yeah, there is definitely a need for the people to be led, etc., for the people to have some moral authority to look up to, etc., to basically base their decisions on their opinion, etc. And you might think about preachers in the past where they were basically psychologists, doctors, philosophers, scientists. Like it was really all of those traits in a single person, right? Because, well, church more or less controlled all of the public discourse, all of the public life even. So it's understandable that the officials of the church, the preachers, the ministers, etc., they were a place to go, so to speak, for a regular human being to figure out what the hell should they do with their life, right? To receive some help, some advice, some direction, etc. So yeah, and they did a pretty good job at that, I should note. And okay, so we might examine some of the traits that Peterson demonstrates to basically prove this hypothesis of mine, if you like. And one of the interesting things that I've noticed while watching his lectures and his talks is that when he is talking, he is almost like in some sort of shamanic trance or something like that. Like he basically, while he's speaking, he's like in this strange kind of state, you know, almost like a raving of a shaman or something like that. And it's quite characteristic that he keeps repeating the same points over and over. Like, let's say if you watch this a series of lectures, maps of meaning, for example, or personality lectures, he keeps repeating many points over and over, like from one lecture to the other. And he doesn't even remember whether he made those points or not. Well, it's exactly because of that, I believe, because he is in this sort of altered state of mind while he's talking. Yeah, and you might watch him, how he behaves physically, like he keeps walking back and forth, you know, during his public lectures, and he's like giving this guy a blessing, so to speak, then giving that guy a blessing, etc. Or if you watch his university lectures, even he's like addressing people while not addressing them actually, you know. So he kind of spreads the blessing here and there. So he really preaches. He says, like you get some blessing, and even you get some blessing, you know, that sort of body language, I guess, plus the tone of his voice. It all kind of goes together here. And another interesting trait that you might notice easily is that he never sticks to the topic. Like, again, even in his university lectures, like, although they kind of formally have some topic usually, he never sticks to that. He just rambles about all kinds of things. Like, he makes like half an hour long digressions, etc. Again, often even repeating himself. And I would claim that it is exactly because his purpose is not to talk about the subject. His purpose is to promote his agenda, his preaching. So he's focused on this preaching part. He uses any kind of topic only as an excuse for the preaching, you know. It's only a window through which we enter this realm of Protestant mass, which I claim he is engaged in. So yeah, that would make sense. I mean, why he never sticks to the topic? But at the same time, you might try to deconstruct his personality and say that, well, okay, he rambles about all kinds of things just because he's a psychopathic Gemini or something like that, which he is, I believe. But okay, that might be an interesting way to look at things. And he usually goes quite long ways to explain things that might be described very easily otherwise, if you just accept this idea of will to power, again, kind of returning to my initial point. But he never mentions that, even though he talks about Nietzsche quite a lot, and he kind of acknowledges that, yeah, he was a genius, etc. But he never mentions the idea of will to power. And it's really baffling to me. I mean, well, it's not quite baffling because I'm going to tell you right now why I think he never does that. And in particular, I think it's already, as I've mentioned, it's dictated by his moralistic pathos. So his moralistic facade of his preaching, of his philosophy, would just completely crumble if he would admit that, yeah, everything is will to power, like people's motivations are fundamentally just will to power, etc. But again, he never says that. He only says that, well, okay, you are going somewhere. Like he starts from this, but why are you going somewhere? How exactly does it work? Where are you going, etc. All those questions that are answered by the idea of will to power, he completely ignores them, right? So yeah, I would say that in some sense he's well, again, if he would have admitted that really everything is will to power, well, it would not be so fancy anymore, you know. It wouldn't be so decent and polished and shiny, right? It would be quite cruel in some sense. It would be quite mechanistic even, or something to that effect. So he tends to willfully ignore this question, fundamentally, or this concept, if you like. And his supporters seem to be ignorant about it also, because, well, I've engaged in some, you know, debates, let's say, in the comment section under his videos, and see my video about comments, by the way. So yeah, they're also treating the concept of power very narrowly. They only like consider it as being something rough and like cruel and violent, whereas in real life it's not always like that, right? And funny thing is that Peterson himself acknowledges the importance of hierarchies, right? Which Nietzsche also does, but Nietzsche clearly says that hierarchies are hierarchies of power, whereas Peterson never adds that part. He always says, well, it's like, let's call it hierarchies of competence, right? But what is competence? It's just another word for power. If you have a competence, which means you can do some things that other people don't, it means you have power. You have more power than these other people, right? You have perhaps some skills that give you power over the external world, just, you know, by the very fact that you have those skills. And at the same time, you have power over other people because, well, they have to ask you for help for doing something because they don't have these skills themselves. So it's clearly a power in a multi-dimensional sense, you know, any sort of competence. So it's really stupid that they are blind to that, both Peterson and his supporters, I believe. And other thing he talks about are the repeatable games. You know, he says that, well, if you're violent, let's say, and there's a pretty famous study of chimpanzees, like if you're violent and just project your power directly, people wouldn't want to deal with you and you'll be quickly crushed by others. And this is all true. And it indeed shows you how morality arises, because if you're a jerk to other people, well, so much for you. I mean, you would quickly disappear. They would make you disappear. So, and that's what morality is all about. Morality arises as a way of regulating your emanation of your will to power, let's say. So again, I see no contradiction here at all. It's like morality is the decent way to emanate your will to power, right? So yeah, so it's also quite baffling in some sense for me to, well, his ignorance of the concept. And okay, another disagreement I have with him is that he keeps putting neo-Marxists, let's say, and postmodernists into the same bin, you know. And I think it's a really bad idea. And he actually admits that neo-Marxists and postmodernists are very different in their basic presuppositions. Like neo-Marxists have the underlying meta-narrative, let's say, that, well, this usual Marxist narrative, whereas postmodernists are directly against any sort of meta-narratives, right? They say that everything is fractured and like discontinuous, etc. So why is he keeps doing that? It's really a mystery. I think the simple answer would be, and probably the correct answer, is that he just don't like both neo-Marxists and postmodernists for some reason. Well, because they contradict his moralistic philosophy. That would be a good reason already. And he just kind of grabs them as like, you know, to produce an image of a generalized image of an enemy, let's say. So he kind of treats them as they were the same thing, whereas they're clearly not. I mean, in some respects, they're very different. So yeah, it's pretty strange. And although, for example, I myself oppose Marxist narrative, I have no problem with postmodernists. I think they are correct in most of their points. Okay, and one other thing I wanted to mention is that his treatment of archetypes is pretty solid. I mean, yeah, there's no mystery in that. I mean, although how much is it his? How much did he take from Carl Jung? It's really hard to tell because I didn't read Carl Jung, so I cannot be an advisor in this case. But he actually treats archetypes somewhat better, I would say, than, let's say, people in the electric universe community do, even though that's a pretty solid insight from Velikovsky that archetypes might have been provoked by some astronomical phenomena, like a very strong polar lights, what Anthony Peratt talks about, for example. But this is a very, very narrow vision. I mean, to some degree it might be true, like some archetypes, like particular images, let's say, might have been inspired by something like that, but in general, it doesn't seem to be the case. Like the very foundation for an archetype seems to be culturally determined, like family, society, those kinds of things, right? Like you might have correspondence between the two, let's say, cultural archetype versus visual representation, right? Which was perhaps observed in the sky, but that's a different thing altogether. Okay, so yeah, but one other thing that I had to mention is that he probably uses the wrong version of history. I mean, the accepted version of history written by Jesuits in the 16th century. But again, that's another topic for a very long discussion. I actually wanted to make a video about history specifically instead of this video, but it would have been very long, even longer than this one, so I decided to stick to this topic for now. Okay, and you might look at his body language. Again, I've already mentioned a couple of points previously, but in general, his body language and the tone of his voice, he like almost asks you to believe him, you know. He wants to inspire you to do something. He like really wants to convince you. So he has some stakes clearly in this. And again, if he's a preacher, that would be understandable, right? Perhaps, although, again, if we're talking about deconstructing his personality, maybe partly it was caused by his university work, you know, as a professor, whoever he is, formally. But that way or another, he wants to incite feelings in you as a listener, or reader, or viewer, I guess. So his rhetoric is, in many respects, pathos-driven. You know, this division by Aristotle on ethos, which is argument from authority, pathos, which is argument from emotion, and logos, which is argument from, you know, logic, basically. So he is severely skewed towards pathos-driven rhetoric. So that's emotional-based rhetoric. Basically, if it sounds right to you, if it incites certain feelings in you, then it should be right. It's that type of rhetoric. So he tries to convince you in this manner, or, well, among others, obviously, but mostly, I would say. So he, you know, almost literally teaches you how to live, which is sort of ridiculous to me. I mean, 12 Rules for Life, the title of his book, I mean, that's just ridiculous. I mean, really, man, like, who are you to set up rules for my life? Like, it's just the level of arrogancy that is needed to title your book this way. It's just amazing, I would say, right? So he tries to, but again, if you follow from this basic assumption that I have, that he behaves like a preacher, it would be understandable. Like, a preacher should teach his flock, you know, as a responsible shepherd, how to live properly, you know, how to follow him in a proper manner, etc. And that's what he does, I believe. He sort of hypnotizes you with his erudition, etc., and rhetoric. And his erudition is, by the way, pretty superficial in many respects. Whereas at the same time, he is smuggling, you know, kind of how at one of the discussions with Sam Harris, somebody mentioned, I think it was Weinstein, by the way, mentioned that the Jesus smuggling, you know, like you talk about something, blah, 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 and then suddenly Jesus appeared out of nowhere in your discussion, and like, as if it was somehow reasonable for him to do so, etc. So he smuggles his moralistic views while you are being hypnotized by his, let's say, quasi-scientific rhetoric and things like that. So I think it's clear that his points are mostly prescriptive rather than descriptive, and again, it's a very strong indication that he's not a scientist, even though formally he has some scientific papers, etc. But as a public figure, he's not a scientist at all. Again, his points are not descriptive, but prescriptive. And again, he never sticks to the topic even, which would be a good indication that he would be a scientist if he did. But he doesn't, etc. So he really is a shepherd of his flock. And he capitalizes on this desire to be led in people, the desire to have a moral authority to look up to, etc., etc. Yeah, and it's quite funny that he keeps speaking about responsibility, let's say, that people should take more responsibility, etc. But just think about it. It's quite sophistical, not even sophisticated. It's really a sophism what I'm up to say, but I still think it's a pretty nice one. Like, if you listen to Peterson and take more responsibility, it actually means that you take less responsibility, because the only reason you're taking responsibility is because you're listening to Peterson, which means that you basically, like, it's his responsibility. Like, you're, let's say, giving him the right to lead you, which means that initially you actually has gotten rid of your responsibility. So by listening to Peterson, you are not leading yourself. It's he who is leading you. That's what I'm saying. So that means less responsibility for you rather than more, you know? It's pretty clear, I think. And another big issue I have with his moralistic philosophy, his preaching, is that he has this idea, which he kept repeating a couple of times, sort of like, if it makes you feel bad it means it is not true, or something to that effect. Or maybe, well, yeah, something to that effect. And I think this is just rubbish. Like, what makes you happy is not necessarily true, you know? I think it should be quite obvious to anyone. So his response to, let's say, nihilism seems to be very weak to me. It's basically, well, nihilism is basically a statement that, okay, it doesn't seem to be the case that any type of value system is better than any other type of value system, and therefore probably any type of value system is rubbish, right? This is the argument of nihilism. And it's a pretty solid argument, you know, like really, it is the case. But Peterson says, no, some value systems are better than the others, because they make you feel better. Well, does that mean they are true in any respect? I don't think so. In fact, like, well, okay, I'll return to this point a bit later, but yeah, it's a pretty big concern to me, what he says. So basically, his response to nihilism is based only on his own charisma, and his own authority, let's say. So that would be ethos-driven rhetoric, right? So you might use Peterson as an anchor in your life, again, getting rid of your responsibility and listening to him, where he says, like, do as I say and you'll feel good. So in this respect, this statement makes a lot of sense, right? But in the sense of the advancement of knowledge, like really figuring the world out, it doesn't make any sense whatsoever. So there's quite a lot of arrogance, I believe, and disrespect to his followers, his readers or listeners, in this position, because basically, and it's funny because, well, basically because he wants to show you how to live properly, right? So that's where disrespect comes from, because, well, he deems other people stupid enough not to be able to figure out their own lives, basically. So he has to lead them. He has to be the shepherd for them, right? So they are just flock for him. So, and it's quite curious that he has his own point, that he keeps repeating, that your ideas are not your ideas. Like, you have only very few, if any, of your own ideas. So most of your ideas you take from someone else. Yeah, this might be true. But again, if your ideas are Peterson's ideas, well, that's another spin to this whole problem, right? You don't really need to follow those ideas if they're not yours, if they're Peterson's ideas. So go figure. So yeah, just to repeat my basic point, he is a preacher, a Protestant pastor, and like culturally, if you think about it, a person like that would be impossible in, let's say, Christian Orthodox culture, or even Catholic culture, let alone any non-Christian cultures. So that's why I say that he is really a Protestant, not just Christian preacher, right? So his general detest towards, let's say, French thinkers is very characteristic. I mean, that he is a Protestant and not Christian in general, etc. And this general sort of narrow-mindedness about him, and this pragmatic approach to things, again, see my comment above about the issue of truth. This pragmatic approach to truth and this almost deliberate narrow-mindedness, like ignoring many significant ideas like will to power, for example, it's very characteristic of American culture, I would say. Now you might say, well, he's Canadian, he's not an American. Well, that's kind of the same thing in this respect, I would say. Even though you might argue that he couldn't have appeared in purely American culture, let's say the US. But yeah, well, that might be a good point, but he's still not European. That's what I mean by American in this context. And yeah, it's really, as a philosopher, he suffers from it, basically. That's what I'm saying. But as a preacher, he feels pretty well, yeah. And here I wanted to add this point that I made previously in my Science and Anarchy video. I really should have expanded it back then quite a bit more, but since I didn't, now I'm gonna use the chance to do it, since we're talking about preachers and Christianity. This point that I've made, that based on Nietzschean idea about the self-overcoming of a Christian, so I've made the point that scientists are actually better Christians than Christians, because scientists are focused on truth, which is one of the key Christian virtues. So let's say a new generation of Christians are scientists. And by new, I mean the one that appeared in roughly the middle of the 17th century, or about so. So, yeah, science is the new Christianity in this sense. That's what I wanted to say. And it's interesting in this respect that atheism is actually a purely Christian phenomenon, if you think about it, right? So this scientific atheism in particular, it did appear just in Christian culture. You wouldn't meet a Muslim atheist, you wouldn't meet a Buddhist atheist, although in Buddhism it's kind of blurry, like what even theist is, you know, because strictly speaking there are no gods in Buddhism or something like that. But anyway, hopefully you get my point, that it really seems bizarre, but at the same time it kind of doesn't, right? So it's this perhaps anarchistic element of Christianity that I've talked about in my Science and Anarchy video that has led to atheism in Christianity itself. So it's pretty interesting. So again, returning to my point that I just made, I think that really scientists are better Christians than Christians in this sense. Okay, or at least, you know, the previous Christians, so to speak, pre-scientific Christians. Okay, and again, I wish to perhaps underline, emphasize this point that I've already made, that I have a serious aesthetical or ethical disagreement with Peterson on this particular subject, that basically his point is that the truth that disrupts your life is not the real truth, you know. And I disagree, like, very strongly with this. It's just rubbish, in my opinion. It's a very clear ideological division between me and Peterson, let's say. I think that any person who seeks knowledge would disagree with Peterson in this respect. So Peterson's stance, his position on this subject, it really fits a, let's say, a decent, normal person type of life, but it's absolutely unfit for any sort of philosopher or scientist, let's say, people who seek knowledge. And because, well, for example, in his own words, Peterson's words, when unknown enters your life, like the thing that he calls the dragon of chaos, it disrupts your map, again, the map of meaning. So you've had a map that seemed to work, but then unknown appeared and kind of tore your map into pieces, and now you don't know what to do, how to behave, etc. Like, everything is under suspicion right now, right? So, and you need to update your map, you need to renegotiate, etc., etc. And all of that is very reasonable. But how is it compatible with this statement of his about the truth? It seems absolutely incompatible. Like, if you seek comfort and like some sort of practicality in truth, basically it would hinder your advancement into the unknown, right? Because again, it means that your map is working, and if it is working, you're not dealing with the unknown, at least yet. And Peterson says that, for example, we are foragers for knowledge, as he says. So we delve into the unknown, we kind of throw ourselves into the unknown, a concept I've already discussed in some of my videos. Like, I remember comment I've made in the potential energy and other dark matters video, for example, about this intellectual tundra, as I've called it. So yes, we are foragers for knowledge, but how are you going to forage for knowledge in this intellectual tundra, in this great unknown, if you seek comfort in the truth you're using? It doesn't make any sense at all. Like, you try to avoid discomfort, well, it does mean that you're not going anywhere. You're not subjecting yourself to all the dangers of the unknown, right? I think it should be pretty self-evident what I'm saying. And maybe you might say, well, it's quite a stupid and romantic sentiment that I'm stating here, and to some degree it would be correct, but I still want to hold on that. It's my ideological position, if you like, that love for wisdom, you know, this almost suicidal desire to reach the ultimate unknown, like just forget about your own persona, let's say, your own safety, and just throw yourself into the unknown. Well, that's what love for wisdom is. That's philosophy, you know. This is what drives philosophy. But since Peterson's philosophy is driven by this desire of comfort and decency, you might say, it's not a philosophy. It's pretty clear, I think. So it is preaching, really. And, like, again, aesthetically speaking, this lifestyle that he proposes is quite pathetic, in my opinion. Again, this sort of comfort-oriented lifestyle. And it's very fitting for Protestant culture, I understand that, and he's very good at it, right? But I mean, tastes differ, but my taste is disgusted by this approach. So yeah, let us probably conclude this long rant. So a few short points to sum this all up. So I believe that Jordan Peterson is not a scientist, nor he is a philosopher, at least as a public person. The way he is present in our current culture, let's say. But he is a preacher, in particular a Protestant preacher. And he willfully ignores certain important concepts like the will to power, let's say, and it makes actually his own philosophy, his own moralistic philosophy, even though I kind of said that he's not a philosopher, but moralistic philosophy is not really quite a philosophy. It's more like ethics, right? So probably I should have used this word instead. So his ethics actually suffers from that. At least it's logos-oriented justification, let's say, because he, again, as I've stated in the beginning, he ends up with these loose threads, which are individually correct, but they are not tied into a single reasonable narrative, which is only it's only possible if you use the idea of will to power. Then everything would make sense. And his pragmatic approach to truth is anti-philosophical. This statement that if it makes you feel bad, it's not true. It's just rubbish. It's just stupid. And again, anti-philosophical, anti-scientific. It doesn't, like again, if you want to be a flock, you know, in this delineated area and just happily graze there, overseen by the shepherd Peterson, then yeah, it would be fitting. But if you want to go beyond into the unknown, if you want to expand in whatever sense, expand the limits, etc., that's a rubbish approach that he's proposing. And so in general, I would say my probably final comment would be that he speaks many right things, as I've said. Like, you can genuinely listen to him and like arrive at some of the things you probably didn't know, and they would be useful to you. But at the same time, their general arrangement, the way he puts everything together, is wrong, in my opinion. Or at least dishonest. That would be probably a better word. Like, he teaches you how you should live, whereas what he should teach you, probably, in my opinion, is that nobody knows how you should live. And that's such a terrible truth that well, and it's just incompatible with his ethics again. So it would ruin his narrative, right? That you should do as I say. Here are 12 rules for life, please follow them and you will be happy, right? He doesn't say, I don't know how you should live. What he probably should have said if he was a philosopher, but he isn't. He is a preacher. Thank you for watching. The eons are closing.